Hello, everyone. My name is Francesco Cipollone. I'm the CEO and founder of Phoenix Security. And today I want to bring you on a date with me and on a journey on vulnerability. I've been in vulnerability management across application security, cloud security, and traditional infrastructure for most of my life. And I have one thing to share with all of you. I never actually fixed a critical vulnerability or a vulnerability at all for what it concerns. I only focus on risk. And I want to bring you on a journey to actually explain why risk is really the king of decision-making from an engineering perspective, but also from a business perspective. Business tend to say, we need to act securely, but what that practically means is ephemeral. And it tend to convert into lip service of, yes, we are a secure business, but what that actually mean in terms from an engineering perspective is always fuzzy. And I want to take you today on a story and on a journey on how to make that message and that risk profile really actionable. And we can only do that with automation, with data, and with risk. Security is heavy enough. And in order to make it lighter, we need to use meme. And that's the benefit of being in security, I guess. So I hope you tolerate memes because this presentation makes quite a use of it. And security, as I said, is heavy enough that if we approach it with a laugh and with a joke, then the message goes through in a bit easier way. So as I mentioned, every presentation need to have the speaker slides, me big face and smiling. So you can see it here, you can see it there. But I've been in the industry for the past 15, 20 years, working across cloud security, application security, and vulnerability management. I'm passionate about this field, as you can feel and see. I've been speaking about how to approach vulnerability in a better approach and avoiding burnout of security professionals. But one of the challenges that I always had is everybody seems to have an opinion around vulnerability and risk, but it's really hard when you have data that backs you up. It's really hard to argue with data. And when your approach on, I think this is exploitable versus there is an exploit available, this machine is actually externally facing, the likelihood of exploitation is X, is really hard to argue with that information. Unless you're a data scientist, and we have the session coming up next where we can discuss and debate around data science and which data set do you choose as a reference to use. So on today's presentation, I want to walk you through the scenario, the current landscape, and the data that sits behind the current landscape, and the current approach that is usually based on SLA and how do we take that approach into the next generation, into the next level? And that is using risk. And I say the risk is the great unifier because unify a lot of these data elements and help us driving a data-driven approach on vulnerability and risk. And to do so, I'm going to explore all the data set that sits behind our research as Phoenix between criticality of vulnerability and the traditional data set that we have from MVD, the popularity of an exploit, the new addition of ransomware and CVE use in the ransomware, EPSS, and edge cases where some of these data might not work. So caveat and gotcha where some of these data don't work. And as I mentioned, I've been in this journey. I feel your pain. And every organization that starts in the vulnerability management space across cloud security or application security or container security is usually presented with a panel of red and critical alert and sometimes false positive that is difficult to explore. And usually we tend to believe the scanner data as the scanner has spoken, the oracle has spoken, and whatever the scanner says, it tends to be taken seriously. But the more we dig into the data, the more we find that some of this information is actually not properly relevant for us, or actually might not be applicable, or might be a false positive, or might be less critical than what a scanner say. If we take the example of Log4j, a scanner has a specific limited view of what a critical is critical. And the other aspect is, a security professional, we don't have the empathy with how engineering works. And we tend to flood all these problems into the engineering backlog that have a lot of other pieces of work to actually continue working, because that's their day job. It's not fixing vulnerability day in and day out, despite the fact as security professional that we hope that will be their job, or we have a dedicated person to actually do so. And usually that's the challenge with security champion. But we're going to touch on that later. The challenge is, as security, we think security is a business problem, but business doesn't recognize security as a business problem or as a product problem. And we, as a security professional, don't recognize our element as part of the workflow and the life cycle. So we end up in this situation where here, there's a vulnerability report or there's a pen test report, you're going to fix all of it, right? You're going to at least focus on at least the critical. And that's what usually happens is business tends to waive off risk, tends to waive off criticality, tend to accept the risk in a blindfolded way, because they don't have a way to understand what is the impact for them in their own world. And then that leads into GRC and into vulnerability table that are completely disconnected, and risk acceptance table that are completely disconnected with the reality. And we're going to have a meeting with a talk in next week with the head of GRC and STAR program from Netflix, exactly on these topics, to actually dive deeper on the connection between risk management, GRC, and engineering, and how we can make this alive and based on data. There's a very new approach for this. But ultimately, our goal as security professional and as engineers inside a piece of work or inside an organization is identifying what to fix first. That is probably not very easy, and it's actually not very easy as a job. And the bigger the organization grows, the more challenging this becomes, because when you have an organization like an SME with 1,000 employees, 100 developers that work throughout, and 2 security professionals that probably need to balance a lot of things, but at least those security professionals have a lot of time, or have an X amount of time to actually deal with security engineers. Everybody knows with each other, so you have that personal relationship. It still takes a lot of time to actually analyze a vulnerability, but you can coordinate that approach in a bit easier way. Now, when you get to a mid-size or a large enterprise, the disconnection between security, business, and engineering becomes wider and wider, and the time you have to actually look at the vulnerability becomes less and less. And what I'd like to focus on is, and we're going to see the data on it, we have tons of vulnerability, but only 10% are actually the vulnerability that are really exploitable. It's actually less. And 5% of the total number of the vulnerability are actually reachable, and 1% are the vulnerabilities that have been targeted now. So let's see some of these data. And this is part of a Gartner research that was looking at, out of a sample set of vulnerability that we consider, how many of the 20,000 are actually exploitable. And this is just one of the factors that we can consider, and we will consider in this presentation. Just one of these factors will reduce drastically the amount of vulnerability that you have to look at, up to 1% almost, or 10% of that number. The challenge is, even with that percentage, is a lot of vulnerability. And if we look at how we approach vulnerability right now across application security and vulnerability management in the cloud and on premises, we tend to focus on SLA. And SLA is inherently a bad number because it's flat, and it doesn't consider the risk level of a specific organization, or a risk level of a specific team or application. So what that results is that SLA get missed all the time because they're flat across the board. So even if you focus on the top critical vulnerability, you will not be able to focus on the medium vulnerability and the low vulnerability, and the ticket time start ticking as soon as the vulnerability get discovered. There are other and specific piece of work that we've done around SLAs, time to resolve, and when SLA timers start ticking. So we're not gonna go in this right now, but there are other considerations around SLA and why SLA in itself is an inherently bad information. Now, let's dive deeper on why are we in this situation and why there is a lot of alert fatigue and alert panic. So if you look at the raw vulnerability data from NVD, we can see a bias of the vulnerability database that critical and high vulnerability almost form the 55% and above 58% of the total number of vulnerability available in the NVD. And then the medium are actually a huge number. The low is just 1% of vulnerability. So there is very high chance that if we take in consideration critical and high, we consider almost half, if not more, of the 270,000 vulnerabilities that are right now available in the NVD. Now, if we explore a little bit more on the typology of the vulnerability or the effect of a vulnerability, we can start seeing patterns of things that are exploited at scale. Like remote code execution, it's just a 30% of the vulnerability, but those are the one most dangerous. And then if we pair this one up with the vulnerability that are actually reachable from a network perspective and external, that is another way to cut the vulnerability data sources and focusing just on a percentage basic of those vulnerabilities that are effective. And this doesn't require any additional technology. This is just an analysis on a classifier that you can use to actually classify the vulnerability by typology of effect or typology of attack, like buffer overflow, memory corruption, SQL injection, and cross-site scripting tend to be more dangerous in the backend application, while cross-site scripting, SSRF, and open redirect input validation, well, input validation might be more widespread. The others tend to be more on a front end. So you can also see which typology of vulnerability are there. And we've seen over the years that the vulnerability have changed and have evolved. Certain type of vulnerability, we stop seeing them altogether. Certain other are increasing, like cross-site scripting, because of the web and API usage and widespread usage. Those vulnerabilities have stayed there, while memory corruption, if you can see, has a deep dive because of the adoption of new and modern framework that we have. But in general, the web-based vulnerability like cross-site request forgery and SSRF or CSRF, those are the two request forgery, those are still very high still to today, because those are vulnerability that are exploited at scale and on the website. So because of our interconnected world, those are still applicable and very modern. Now, let's look at the funnel. And I've been talking about the 10% of vulnerability that matter, the 1%. I'm going to show you and I'm going to prove you with data on how you can reduce your vulnerability to the 0.1% of the total number of vulnerability database. Now, at this point in time, we actually pushing 207,000 vulnerability in the NVD and more being recorded so far. We've done an enormous amount of research to actually cross-reference all the vulnerability that are available in GitHub, and all this information are available on our website to further review and cross-reference some of these data sets. But just this and the bug bounty hot vulnerability, we already reduced that 204,000 vulnerability in 9,000 vulnerability, 70,000 for the one active in the bug bounty platform, and 9,000 just in the one that are potentially exploitable. So GitHub exploit available, proven exploit available. Now, if you narrow down on the actual verified exploit, and you can take CISA KEV, for example, or the non-exploited vulnerabilities, a manually curated database of vulnerability from CISA, part of the US government sponsorship, or GitHub verified exploited, is data set that we analyze cross-referencing where a vulnerability is actually used in the wild and has a module in Metaexploit and other exploit databases. Those vulnerabilities are reduced to 0.41% of 1,000 roughly vulnerability from the original 204,000 vulnerability. So we already are targeting 0.41% of the total landscape of vulnerability. Now, if we further narrow down and we take into consideration things like exploit prediction scoring system, or EPSS, that is basically looking at the probability of exploitation right now and in the next 30 days of specific vulnerability coming from a series of honeynet data. And we're going to discuss later on with one of the creators of EPSS from Scientia. We are already going down to 0.19%. And then if we cross-reference the active exploit or the verified exploit in GitHub that have a high percentage of EPSS or EPSS above 0.7, we are already at 0.1 or 0.2%. From the original 240,000 vulnerability, we narrow down the scope and the focus to 400 vulnerability. And then if we take it further on and say, okay, which one of these 400 vulnerability are actually exploited or actually present externally, or which one are these on critical asset? If we take even these two elements into consideration, we are going to be on 0.1% or 0.01% of those original data set. This to say that we don't need to submit to the vulnerability overload and to the scanner overload and be flooded with all this alert fatigue. And without this information, the challenge is, as a business, we hear Log4j, or we hear critical vulnerability, or a 0-day. And the reaction, the knee-jerk reaction is panic. Do I have that problem? Am I going to get hacked? As a business owner, those are the information that cause panic. And the knee-jerk reaction is talking to my security professional and saying, are we going to get hacked? Let's fix all this problem altogether. And we've seen this year that we had one of these high critical alert on a weekly basis. Or recently we had curl and libcurl that was vociferated as critical vulnerability. It was actually reduced to much less. Log4j, Spring4Shell, again, last year, were causing massive panic on updating library directly and indirectly. And without this data, we can't actually sort out, or we can figure out between those vulnerability and other critical vulnerability, which one are gonna get us hurt. And without data, we're never gonna be able to have that judgment or fight back or discuss back with the business on saying, these are our external assets. These are the one vulnerability that are actually likely to be exploited because they have an exploit available and highly likely to be exploited in the wild. So let's focus on the external surface first, and then the second line of external surface, and then all the way down to the internal in a sequenced approach. No business person will ever fight back that kind of reasoning because it's logical and it's based on data. So, business, and how do we communicate with the business with all of this very technical information, and how we can convert this into a business talk. What is love or what is risk? Baby, don't hurt me. And as I said, we need to joke a little bit on these terms, because if we only talk about data, it becomes a little bit heavier. So I want to go with you on a journey on why I really like risk as a way to communicate with the business on these kind of terms of likelihood of exploitation and the ability to discern on what is more risky, what is less risky. The challenge is when you talk to an executive or anybody on the C-suite and you start talking about vulnerability, the reaction is, I don't understand this report. I don't understand this tons of information on this executive. I had tons of critical. Which one do we focus on? We're going to get hacked. Those are the information, knee-jerk reaction that we're going to get from a business person. And if we present that on a weekly basis, we're going to get kind of a rejection by default, because if we scream continuously that we have critical problem, the reaction is maybe those critical problems are not that critical. On the other point, if we talk about risk to the engineering community, they talk about number of sprint stories or number of action point that needs to be done on the next sprint if you're working in Scrum or Agile. Those kind of terms don't communicate and don't tell them anything that is relevant in their context. So we need to be able to speak with the business in terms of risk, because that's in their context. They can express, I want to operate at this risk level, or I want to operate at this other risk level. And that doesn't even tell engineers what critical vulnerability they need to solve. but we can translate that information from an engineering perspective on which are the critical vulnerability or the non-critical vulnerability that's going to have the biggest impact to achieve that risk level from a business perspective. And that's the way to connect a risk objective that is a context of business into engineering community, into number of actions that needs to be resolved or execute to actually meet those expectations. And in order to do so, it's not rocket science, it's not ephemeral science, and this is our interpretation of risk. So we take the base severity of the vulnerability and we use base severity for a very specific reason. We use base severity because it's a common language across all the vulnerability that we have available right now, and it doesn't tamper with any other information. Then we take the probability of exploitation that is derived by, in an automated fashion and in an automated way, by the likelihood of exploitation. If there is threat intelligence that tells us that that information on that vulnerability is exploited in the wild, if there is a fix available or not, or where that particular asset located externally facing or internally facing is. And all of those information give us a good sense of what is the likelihood of exploitation of a specific vulnerability. And then the last but not least important element of risk is, what is the business impact? How much this particular set of risk is going to impact me as a business, or how many users, or how much importance has this particular application. Now, I want to say, and I want to put a caveat that I'm not going to go in detail around several aspects, but it is important to consider in further research on three terms, that is reachability. So if a particular vulnerability is actually reachable from a network perspective or non-network perspective, or a particular line of code is actually reachable from a library perspective. Those concepts, we're going to go around those concepts, we can actually build a whole presentation around it. And we've been talking in the past around this. But exploitability is another concept that we really talk into and through, and we're going to see a little bit more because it's relevant to this particular presentation, versus context that we already discussed. And there is business context as well as system context. So where that particular vulnerability manifests from a network perspective, from a location perspective, is it external, is it internal, the system where that particular vulnerability manifests. So let's see the magic behind risk and risk calculation. Now, I tend to use and I tend to love the use of a matrix that is easy to harder in terms of automation and in terms of data accessibility. Now, we have the level 1 where we can take all the vulnerability in bulk and automate using and achieving, as we've seen in the funnel before, a very finite and a very short number of vulnerability, or finite number of vulnerability, looking if there is an exploit available, or if people are targeting that particular vulnerability. That's what we call popularity with bug bounty. Or if in the CVSS vector, this particular vulnerability is attackable by a network perspective, and this particular vulnerability has a remote code execution attribute that will tell us that it's easy, or to a specific percentage, to deploy a piece of code remotely to the system. Now, reachability from a code perspective and partially from a network perspective becomes much harder to understand and calculate, where the other factor that we explored are easier to calculate because there is data availability already at scale on those information. And the scale between harder and easy on this scale, on the vertical scale, is a risk-reward opportunity that I see. So the harder it is, the harder and more time and effort we need to invest in terms of calculating this information, and the less we receive in terms of benefit from this calculation. So we like to balance and take an approach that takes a lot of this information and enough information that enable us to make a decision, because that's the ultimate goal we want from a triaging perspective and from a vulnerability management perspective. So from a location perspective, we can see if something is exploitable remotely, where it is from a location perspective, is it externally facing, is it internally facing, and more harder to calculate, is there a particular attack chain path that this particular vulnerability or a set of vulnerability can be chained together. Again, from easier, I mentioned the data point, from the easier point to the harder point. And those needs to be considered from a risk reward perspective. And lastly, but not least, is business criticality. So is this particular application business critical for me, and hence I need to focus a bit more or less? And hence we have two systems, that is a business impact assessment or fair analysis that is a bit more complex and deliver a more granular perspective on risk and business impact, but also is much harder to implement. And list the area that we can't really automate, that is the manual triage. So this is the last stage where we can determine if it's a false positive, is something that's been raised by the scanner that is actually not exploitable. But there is an element that we're doing right now, that is we put false positive and manual triage at the beginning of the flow, not at the end of the flow. Hence, at the end of this flow, the number of vulnerability that we end up dealing with is 0.01%. If we put the manual triage at the beginning of the flow, the number of vulnerability that we have to deal is 270,000. So there is a scale difference in here. And the likelihood and the chance in terms of risk reward perspective that something gonna go amiss is very high. While in this chance, in this particular environment, is very low. Now, if we take the concept of exploitability, we have different level of exploitability. We have how likely is a vulnerability to be exploited in the wild by popularity. So how many people are looking at it, how many links in GitHub are available or in packet storm, or how many people are targeting that particular vulnerability from a bug bounty perspective. From an exploitability perspective, we have also the element of 0 day, where there is no patch available. So usually those are not, it's rare that we hear a 0 day that we usually hear a 0 day when it's too late and when it's exploited in the wild. So for this, there are mitigating control or mitigation element. There is a Google 0 day project and Trend Micro 0 day project that have some of this information available, and few other less more obscure sources of information about 0 day. As I mentioned before, there is an element of automation of an exploit, and hence exploitability by automation. That is there a vector or a particular element in the vector that tells us that that exploit is remotely executable or requires zero authentication? Those are the two parameters we tend to focus a lot in the vulnerability exploit, or if that particular vulnerability is a remote code execution. Hence, the exploit and the payload of a vulnerability can be deployed remotely. And the other data aspect that is really key to actually prioritize vulnerability is this particular exploit exploited at scale and is actively used at scale. Now, there are caveats where the threat intelligence come into place, where certain cases shows us from a broad cyber threat intelligence that this vulnerability is exploited in the wild at broad scale. And then there is targeted CTI that tells us there are specific threat actors that are targeting this set of vulnerability at scale because of ransomware, because of your industry, because of you. And there is an element of risk reward against in this perspective, where if your loss or the consequence of an exploit are actually super high, you should consider targeted CTI or expensive CTI, because it tend to be not cheap to implement good CTI, because it's usually manually analyzed data that needs to be put in there. But that has an extreme value if you can identify an exploit before you get hit. Again, risk-reward perspective, the broad CTI like EPSS enable you to jump on a vulnerability or to reduce the noise of a vulnerability. Now, as part of the data analysis, we did an overview of the top 10 vulnerability that is either more exploited, more critical, or more exploited at scale. Now, the popularity concept, again, we can see some pattern around. It's interesting to see that the top critical vulnerability are actually Oracle, Apache, Debian, while the more exploited vulnerability from EPSS perspective and in terms of number of exploit available at scale is actually Microsoft. So if you already take criticality as an element to actually decide if a vulnerability is exploitable or not, you're already too late. And you're already doing something wrong because you're focusing on the wrong vulnerability that people are not looking at versus you missing the vulnerability that people are looking at. Oracle and Log4j is popular and kind of across the board available throughout. Apache, Struts, Debian vulnerability, these all come from the amount of installation. And we're going to see this number actually reconfirmed from who is targeting this vulnerability at scale from a ransomware perspective. And I have one of my favorite sentences is, not all the critical are critical and not all the source are actually good source of information. So we're going to see and compare here in the next section, source of vulnerability information. I'm going to go a little bit faster. So on the left, we're going to see the analysis from GitHub NVD database. And on the right, we're going to see the CISA KEV and EPSS and compare the two datasets. If we see the first dataset that is just criticality, again, Oracle, Apache, Debian, Microsoft, those are performing well, while in CISA KEV, in terms of number of vulnerabilities that are actually actively that have an active exploit at scale, we can see Microsoft jumping very high up in the score, Adobe, Apple. So there is a big discrepancy between choosing just the critical vulnerability or looking at the vulnerability that are actually being confirmed to have an exploit. And all of these links will be available in the PDF and in the website, so you can actually play with this data set and see and dig a little bit more into these data sets. Now, the popularity of an exploitation, we can see the numbers of link available throughout several platforms. Microsoft, Oracle with Log4j, Debian, Apache, Red Hat, the top exploited operating system are actually the one that have the majority of vulnerability at scale across various data sets. And then if we take high EPSS and the previous data sets, we can see that out of all the GitHub exploit available, just a fraction of them are actually available and actually exploited in the wild. And if we take the same information around EPSS and CISA KEV, we can see again a fraction, a very finite number of those are available. The reason why we take EPSS above 0.6 or 0.7 is because those are the factors that we consider to have the vulnerability more exploited at scale. And then we have a certain division above basically the 0.7 where the majority of EPSS are at. But is even a further refinement of all the vulnerability available. And if you can see, a lot of the vulnerability, up to 94%, are scoring a value that is 0.1, 1%, or 0.1 or 1% of likelihood of exploitation in the wild. So this enables us to really focus on the vulnerability that actually really matters. Now, CISA KEV also has published a top routinely exploited vulnerability. I'm going to go a little bit faster on this element, where we can see the top 12 vulnerability exploited in the wild at scale. And you can see, again, these data sets available. Recently, CISA KEV has also crossed two projects together that is basically the number of vulnerability exploited between the CISA KEV entry and used by ransomware. And again, in here, we don't see a lot of surprises. So Microsoft is the one that has the biggest attack surface overall, hence why they're being targeted by the exploit. Now, I want to rephrase and I want to refresh the concept that a lot of this information can be automated and can become the probability of exploitation together with location that enable you to focus on the 0.1% or even less if you consider business location, business context, and location that leads you to a 0.01% of the total number of vulnerabilities that you have to consider. So to wrap it up, the data set to consider are EPSS for the probability of exploitation, CTI against a bit more refined CTI to actually look at the likelihood of exploitation, element that I use in ransomware from the CISA KEV database, location of an asset for the likelihood of exploitation, and the reachability from network, as well as the type of vulnerability. Now, how easy is to deploy an exploit? The element you should consider is the popularity of an exploit. So how widespread is that exploit? How likely and how many times are actually is this exploit used at scale? If it's widely available, if it's been verified, or if there is a module that actually for this particular exploit to be deployed, and again, exploit being used in the wild, leveraging EPSS or your CTI data. And you can see the various modules. We did also an analysis on the top 12 and the methodology of attack from the top vulnerability exploited last year. And as you can see, remote code execution is the one that is most used because logically, those vulnerabilities are easier to implement and easy to weaponize at scale, either if you use ransomware or if you do specific targeted attack. Now, I want to cover in the last 5 minutes a couple of edge cases where some of this information might or might not be useful. So EPSS tend to have a 16 to 30 days synchronization effect with new vulnerability at scale. So if we take OpenSSL vulnerability that was mentioned at the beginning of this year, temporary had a 4.5, ended up being very high for a specific amount of period. But EPSS score was super, super low for a long time, while the CTI interest for targeted and refined CTI information was really high because of the distribution across number of systems available. So it was something that attacker really looked into. Another vulnerability that later on got really attention and got really exploited at scale was VMware or QNAP systems, because those vulnerabilities got a lot of attention from ransomware perspective. Originally CVSS 8.8, a lot of high interest from CTI. Again, EPSS very low, and it ended up catching up later stage. So those are cases and caveat when using CTI versus EPSS, that there is a little bit of a delay between when a vulnerability gets published and when a vulnerability gets exploited at scale. So to wrap it up, you can get information around likelihood of exploitation in comparison with EPSS. When EPSS is low, always double check if the vulnerability widespread, if there are a number of systems, for example, in Shodan or gray noise that are highly exploited or highly available. Or shadow servers is another good data source of information, as well as HackerOne data and other bug bounty data to see fundamentally if that vulnerability is exploited in the wild. We have a lot of this information under exploitability and under probability of exploitation and under popularity in Phoenix Security to actually enable you to do this at scale. And the least but not last, you can see the methodology of attack like CWE, CAPEC. This becomes a little bit more complex to dig into. So I want to conclude that vulnerability at scale tend to be a tunnel and very hard and very heavy to explore and dig into, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. To summarize, manual triage is not practical, it's not effective. EPSS is a great source for prioritization. Context, location, and other factors can help further down refining the vulnerability exploitation and the one you should focus on. And risk enable us to talk with the business in a better way. And if we identify the single thread of risk to vulnerability, we can enable the business to communicate and to connect with the majority of people. Now, I want to leave with a last comment that is, this is what we do at scale with Phoenix Security. We are a data-driven company that use a lot of the data set to actually contextualize, prioritize, and deliver high-quality feed to engineer at scale. You can find us on phoenix.security, and a lot of these data sets are available. We love the community, so we made available a version of Phoenix Security with OWASP, and you can get access to the Phoenix Security Edition from OWASP using this QR code that you have available in here. A lot of these data sets and a lot of this information are actually also available on some of the write-up and the publication that we did around vulnerability management at scale and application security program at scale. You can find them using the QR code, as well as the new tool publication that we did around the use of SLA and how to move away from SLA and into a more data-driven and risk approach. Again, the QR code will lead you to the specific page, or building resilient application security and cloud security program using this QR code. We also discuss around this particular topic on the podcast, CSCP, or Cybersecurity and Cloud podcast, with a lot of thought leadership around the world. So I'd like to thank everyone for your time and effort. And I want to thank all our defenders for actually defending and helping our business to get up to date and safe every day. It's not an easy job, and we're here to help you all to get less burnout and more focus. Thank you very much. I'm going to open the floor to the question. I'm going to stop recording right now.